I think about A Link Between Worlds a lot. It's one of my favorite 2D Zeldas, and overall, one of my favorite games of all time. I also think about great video game bosses a lot. So today, I thought, why not try to rank all the bosses in one of my favorite Zelda games? This is my personal ranking of the boss fights in The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds for the Nintendo 3DS. The first encounter with the game's main bad guy YUGA is not all that memorable. It's really short and not very difficult. I always found it a little bit awkward that in A Link Between Worlds, we face the main villain right away and can cause him problems so early on. Narrative aside, the fight is pretty brain-dead simple too. You might have some trouble if you try to chase him down with just the sword, but with one simple arrow shot, YUGA can be stunned, allowing Link to run around the circle path and start wailing on him with the sword. Do this about 4 or 5 times to get the win. This isn't a bad fight by any means, but its short length and simplicity makes it my personal least favorite fight in the entire game. MOLDORM is the first of many bosses we'll talk about today that are direct callbacks to the ones in A Link to the Past. While YUGA can be a cakewalk, MOLDORM is definitely a step up on the difficulty scale, and while it's still not very challenging, I do like the concept of the worm getting faster and angrier every time you strike its weak point, its tail. Also, visually, this is a pretty cool fight because of the perspective. Fighting on this raised, graded platform allows you to see the floor below the boss fight and get a sense of height and perspective. The raised elevation is also accentuated by the 3D effect on the Nintendo 3DS. This gives the encounter a sense of height and scale that far exceeds the one in A Link to the Past. But at the end of the day, I'm ranking MOLDORM pretty low because all we have to do really is chase at it and slash its tail. Personally, I like more creativity in Zelda boss fights. The second time you fight YUGA, this time inside of a chamber of Hyrule Castle, is certainly reminiscent of the first encounter, but it's a lot more involved and memorable, earning it a few spots higher in my ranks. During this fight, YUGA and 2 clones pop in and out of the chamber walls, firing a barrage of electric beams and even some enemies your way as a distraction. This leads to a pretty chaotic battle in which you're trying to keep track of the real YUGA as he enters and exits the wall, and then striking him whenever you have the chance. This is absolutely a fun boss fight, but again, similarly to the first YUGA fight, it's very short if you know what you're doing. Though they are both good in concept, the 2 YUGA encounters in this game are a bit of a letdown due to their ease and duration. Maybe I'm in a minority here, but I found ZAGANAGA, the boss of the Desert Palace, by far the most difficult fight in A Link Between Worlds. The concept here is that you need to use the sand rod to navigate between these platforms that are raised up out of the quicksand. The key is making safe paths for yourself around the solid platforms, trying to get close enough to the boss to actually hit him. The problem for me though was exactly this: getting close enough to the boss to do any damage. I'd always seem to be too slow, and he'd begin to move away before I got near him. Because of this, I ended up resorting to a somewhat cheap strategy of shooting him from afar with the bow whenever he popped up from the sand. This was a pretty slow method of clearing this fight, and it made it kind of a slog in all honesty. Maybe it was just me being unusually slow, but I couldn't figure out how to reach him fast enough to beat him the real way. Other than that though, I think the boss concept is solid and encourages a cool use of the sand rod, which is something I can definitely appreciate. I'm curious to know in the comments, did anyone have the same struggles that I did with this boss, or was it just me? DHARKSTARE of the Ice Ruins is one of the more simple boss fights in A Link Between Worlds. You simply melt his protective ice covering with the fire rod, and then when his true form is exposed, you can smack him with your sword. Though very simple in concept, this one is actually one of the game's tougher fights in my opinion. His attacks can be tricky to dodge and he hits pretty hard. Unless you have his patterns memorized, you'll definitely be taking a few hits here and there. Overall though, I didn't see this boss as all that creative. I have DHARKSTARE in the lower mid-range when it comes to A Link Between Worlds boss fights. Similarly to DHARKSTARE, the giant stone turtle boss, GRINEXX, is pretty simple in concept as well. It starts submerged in the lava below you. He stays within the lava for this quick first phase, where you need to use these gaps in the graded floor to time a hit with a falling ice block from the ice rod, which will drop through and hit the boss. After a few rounds of this, the turtle form emerges and fights you on top of the graded platform. It's here where you simply need to dodge his attacks, and at the same time, attack him when you can with the weapon of your choice. The GRINEXX fight is fun in the moment, but there isn't much that's very memorable or creative about the fight after that initial phase. I would definitely say this one is fitting for the midpoint of these rankings, and a perfect example of a mid-tier boss fight in this game. MARGOMILL is kind of a boring design. It's just a spinning top with an eyeball on it. It's only this high in the ranks because the fight itself is a bit more unique and complex than the ones that came before it. There's a two-step process to defeating this boss. First, you slash at it to remove the layered discs that make up its body. Once you get to the bottom of the stack, it's time for step 2. As the weak point, its eye becomes exposed. You then use the tornado rod to propel yourself up to the top of it, in turn dizzying the eyeball and stunning the boss. From atop the boss, you can hack away at the exposed eyeball, dealing some real damage. I also like this one because it spins like a top around the arena and tries to knock you off like the Hitmontop game in Pokemon Stadium 2. Swamp Palace introduces another repeat boss from A Link to the Past, but it brings with it a concept I really enjoy, using the hookshot to pick off his many gelatinous eyeballs one by one. Pulling off and destroying every eyeball leads to Arrghus's real eyeball being exposed, which is the true weak point where you can deal actual damage to him. Yeah, single eyeballs are seemingly a common theme with these A Link Between Worlds bosses. However, when you do manage to remove all the eyeball bubbles from his exterior, he also goes berserk and starts jumping around the room, rapid firing lasers at you. This leads to a pretty intense encounter where essentially you just have to dodge to survive the onslaught while finding safe moments to come in and strike without taking too much damage in the process. Using hookshot into sword is a satisfying combo, and the pure intensity of this encounter puts it pretty high on my rankings. Number 4 is probably my favorite boss visual design in the whole game. GEMESAUR King is a newly blinged out version of the Dark Palace boss from A Link to the Past. Aside from the flashy new look, this fight is pretty solid mechanically as well. The only flaw I want to point out, which is sort of a common one with these A Link Between Worlds bosses, is that it's very short if you know what you're doing. Despite this, GEMESAUR King is pretty dangerous, especially in his second phase. After destroying his rupee-adorned outer shell and getting rich in the process, his mask is removed, revealing his shadowy true form and beady glaring eyes. He switches the lights out and chases you fast around the room with only his glowing eyes visible. It's at this point when we need to make use of our lamp to light the room's torches and make him vulnerable to attacks yet again. Using the power of light like this, I think is a fitting way to destroy the boss of a palace called the Dark Palace. First of all, this boss makes you hate him right off the bat, due to him locking you in the chamber, separating you from the thief girl whom you're trying to save from captivity in the dungeon, and taunting us with some actual dialogue lines. Aside from this, I love this fight due to its implementation of Link's signature ability in A Link Between Worlds, the wall merge mechanic. STALBLIND might seem difficult at first because he can turn invulnerable and block seemingly every attack with his massive shield, but this very same shield is actually the key to defeating him. Getting close enough to his shield allows you to merge into it, just like you would with a wall, causing you to, in STALBLIND's eyes, effectively disappear into thin air. He then raises his arms in frustration, allowing you to pop out from his shield, landing behind him and giving you the chance to freely strike him from behind. Clever, right? After you pull off this trick enough times, he smartens up and loses the shield, coming at you with some stronger sword swings and his own version of Link's spin attack. Dodge it and he'll become dizzy, allowing you to get some more all-important sword hits in. And for his final phase, his head pops off and starts spewing a dangerous black gas, all while his decapitated body angrily swings the sword at you. This is by far the hardest one of his attacks to dodge, but you just need to be evasive enough to chase down the body with your sword and finish him off. At the end of the day, this is not a super difficult fight, but an awesome concept that definitely made me smile when I encountered it on my first playthrough. Despite this boss having a pretty boring design, as it's just a giant hand with an eyeball on it, this is easily one of my top 2 boss fights in the game overall. Here's why. For starters, on my first attempt, he had me kind of puzzled on exactly how to beat him. I was running around trying to dodge his flying fist, but the attack started to feel impossible to dodge due to its high speed. However, I eventually did find a way to dodge it, and this creative dodging method ended up being the key to this battle. This was, yet again, the wall merge mechanic. As you can probably tell, the boss fights that made use of this mechanic were among my favorites in the game, and I honestly wish it was used for more bosses, because it led to some really unique ideas and fun moments that are wholly unique to A Link Between Worlds. Anyways, back to this fight. Once you figure out the wall merge dodge, KNUCKLEMASTER will crash into the chamber wall, leaving you unharmed and him stunned, eyeball exposed, ready for you to go wild on it with sword swings. His second phase gets even crazier as he starts madly slapping the floor and breaking tiles off as he goes, shrinking the battlefield and hindering your movement options. It should be noted, you definitely can cheese the slap as it's easily dodged if you merge into the wall, but even then, once most of the floor goes, dodging it can still be pretty tricky. If you can survive long enough, eventually he reverts back to his rocket fist, for which you can then make use of your wall merge strategy to make him crash and eventually finish him off. This is a great boss. It almost doesn't feel fair putting a Link Between Worlds final boss, YUGA Ganon, as the #1 best boss in the game because there's so much that goes into the fight. From the trek into Lorule Castle to face him, to the cutscenes that lead up to the encounter, this fight is set on a grand scale, and the battle itself doesn't disappoint. I love how the first phase gives us a nice callback to A Link to the Past final boss, with this fusion of Yuga and Ganon wielding a trident and even sending it spinning, hovering around the battlefield just like in the SNES game. Then, the second phase even channels some Phantom Ganon and gives us that classic Zelda trope of having a tennis match using this floating orb. I'm a sucker for these kind of fights. I just think that having a rhythmic phase in a boss fight feels really good, and I think this kind of section is just iconic for a Link vs Ganon battle at this point. Getting through phase 2 sees Ganon make use of the same wall merge mechanic that Link uses throughout the game, while at the same time, Link is awarded with this game's final special item by Princess Zelda, the Bow of Light, which allows us to truly put an end to Yuga Ganon via the power of the Triforce. At first, Ganon seems to be able to keep the light arrows at bay, but only clever players will figure out the trick. Occupy him with one arrow, and while he's dealing with that, pop out of the wall and send another arrow to hit behind him. This will lead to an epic conclusion. Yuga Ganon comes back onto the battlefield for one final tennis match, and then we get a final showdown within the wall. However, this time, he deflects your arrows straight away with no lag. How are we supposed to hit him from behind when he's always facing us? Well, if you're even more clever, you'll eventually figure out how. With one final, brilliant moment of boss design to emphasize this final blow in a way only A Link Between Worlds can, we learn we can actually fire an arrow in the opposite direction. And since this castle chamber wall is circular, that single light arrow will wrap all the way around, striking Ganon in the back without him even knowing it. Doing this leads to what is probably the most satisfying moment of the entire game, when Yuga Ganon is felled. Yuga Ganon is a truly great final boss for a truly great game, and it's a fight that's so much fun, I just have to revisit it every once in a while. So, what do you think of my A Link Between Worlds boss rankings? Do you agree? Disagree? Let me know if you're an A Link Between Worlds fan, and send me your thoughts in the comment section down below. As always, thanks for listening to me talk about a game that I really love. And remember to keep it here for more quality Nintendo content like this. I'll see you in the next one.